Hey y'all, welcome back to the Contrarians. I'm Marco, here with my co-host Nick, and we're going to be talking about Iron Maiden. What's the best Iron Maiden album?
Well, Eddie, what is it? It's Killers.
Yeah, I would disagree with that. I think that some of their later albums are better, right? Like Power Slave, you got 2 Minutes to Midnight, then you have Peace of Mind with the Trooper, and you got Number of the Beast, which is a classic. How can you say Killers is better than those albums? Everybody knows Iron Maiden because of their singer Bruce Dickinson.
I understand what you're saying, but that's not what Iron Maiden started as. Iron Maiden started originally much more punk influenced, and they had a singer called Paul Di'Anno. And if we're going to be honest about these albums, which we're trying to be on the Contrarians here, Iron Maiden's first album to me is a little bit underpolished. There's not quite enough production value. There's little flaws here and there that if you listen to can kind of take you out of the mood. But Killers is where they actually bumped up their production value. They got a whole new producer. He whipped them into shape. Steve Harris, the bassist, he really started to take control and assert himself as a songwriter. And you can hear it all throughout the album. They have this punk sound that Paul Di'Anno brought to influence the bass of the Steve Harris and the Dave Murray more heavy metal classical sound. And that combination in itself is what really birthed that sound of metal, where it's fast, it's in your face, it's grimy, it's so grimy. Paul Di'Anno, his lyrics, you're not going to hear him singing about the seventh son of a seventh son, prophesizing the destruction of it. No, he's singing about running around town because the cops are after him because he is accused of murdering someone. And maybe he did, because he's Paul Di'Anno, and he's crazy, and he's awesome, and he's grimy, and it comes across. And if you're looking for an Iron Maiden album that is going to have the technical skill of their later work, that is going to have almost the same production value, I'd argue it's 80 to 90% of the way there. It's not quite on the level of like Number of the Beast or Power Slave, where those hits are. Those really, really wonderful hits. But honestly, I get a little bored listening to a whole album that talks about pharaohs and magic and knights and swords and all this stuff. It's hard to do that for an entire album. It's much easier to relate to an album where they're talking about being on the streets, being on the run, having to deal with real life problems, and this guy isn't perfect, and he expresses that through his music and through songwriting. And songs like Wrathchild are always good, and a lot of the times we talk about how on the Contrarian, the albums that we're picking, the bands don't like them, the bands don't think the songs are still good. Well, Iron Maiden still plays almost all the best songs from that era live, and Bruce Dickinson, the new singer, who everyone knows, who is great and very operatic and technically a better singer than Paul Di'Anno, he doesn't do as good his job because he doesn't have that griminess. I don't know. What do you think, though?
Well, you were talking earlier about how Iron Maiden originally kind of had that punk feel to them, right? Well, later on, I feel like they became more polished and they became more cleaner, and they had like a better, more heavy metal sound and more heavy metal aesthetic to them. Killers to me kind of sounds more like they were following that trend of the punk bands that were coming out at that time, and maybe even a little bit too late, right? Because that was the early 80s when punk bands were already kind of coming out just before that. So to me, when they went on and moved on and got Bruce Dickinson singing, to me it kind of sounded like they were kind of more at the cutting edge of what they were doing than when they were trying to follow that kind of punk phase, right?
I think adding Bruce Dickinson and letting Adrian Smith write more, definitely gave them that later sound and that pocket that they fell into, which is it's a great niche and it's a great sound. And Iron Maiden is one of those bands that just took all their influences and they really crafted it into something unique and special, and they really started to lean more on that fantasy element, like Eddie here. And if we take a look at the sleeves, we can see that on these later albums they've gone full fantasy, complex and interesting ideas.
But you got fantasy elements going on with the cover of Killers, right? He's a zombie. It's the same thing.
Yeah, but if you look at it, it's a much more unique, to me personally, aesthetic, because they're taking the fantasy elements of the later Iron Maiden, and they're crashing it with a rough and tumble street life type thing. You know, Eddie in this, he's not a puppet on the puppet, being the puppet master of the devil, or he's not, you know, a pharaoh in a mystical temple. He's just a murderer with an axe zombie. You know, it's more straightforward. It's more in your face, and it's more honest. It's them saying we just want to rock out and kick in your face, and we're a little bit evil. And they lost that when they went to the fantasy element. I believe personally. You know, they create something great and unique, but it's not as driving. It's not as in your face. It may be technically heavier, but I don't personally find it to be as powerful.
So the point of the Contrarian is for me to argue, you know, the argument of the public opinion. You know, most people who know Iron Maiden identify with the albums that came out in, you know, in the 80s that featured Bruce Dickinson, right? A lot of people that are Iron Maiden fans don't refer to those first two albums as the better Iron Maiden albums. Almost unanimously, people consider Bruce Dickinson a better singer, and those are the albums after Killers that people look back at and consider the classic Iron Maiden albums.
I think what I would say is that if you look on the first two albums, and especially Killers, you can find the genesis and really some songs that could have just, if they were produced a little better, been on Number of the Beast, been on Power Slave. But you don't find anything that Paul Di'Anno could have done in his time there, like songs like Wrathchild or Murders in the Rue Morgue. You're not going to find that later on in their discography. They lost something, and they had everything they needed to be that fantasy band when they moved forward. And I love Bruce Dickinson. He's great. He's wonderful. And you know, Iron Maiden today have produced such a great discography. But what the fans like about Iron Maiden could happen, and did happen on those first two albums, especially Killers. But what they did that was unique there doesn't appear again ever in their discography.
Right. I'm just saying, if I were to walk down the street and talk to, you know, the average person and ask them to name a few Iron Maiden songs, they would be naming like Run to the Hills and stuff like that. They probably wouldn't name a single song off any of those first two albums. And if you listen to hard rock and heavy metal radio today, especially like AM or FM radio, you won't hear anything from Killers, you know? Like, you'll mostly hear anything after Killers.
I hear what you're saying. But what I would counter is that those are songs, right? So there's some great Iron Maiden songs after. Top of the line, you know, triple grade A. But if you're looking for an album that just is never going to bore you, or you're never going to say, oh, that's a little corny, you need to listen to Killers. You don't want to listen to some of their other works. You know, they have some songs that they experiment with the fantasy style, and it doesn't really work. Like, personally, I don't like songs like might get a little bit of flack for this, but like Flash of the Blade. To me, that song, after the first time I heard it, yeah, that's really cool. I just played D&D, and like they're singing about like what my guy would have done. And the second time I heard it, I was like, and the third time I was like, skip, because it's kind of corny, you know, and it's fun, but once it loses its novelty, it's gone. And I love Iron Maiden, but for a lot of their later discography, that's a big problem. Once you lose the novelty of that song, it's not a fun song to listen to. Killers, every song on that track is great. Even the more instrumental tracks or the somber tracks, like even the like Ides of March or something like that, it's still interesting. It still has something to give beyond just ooh, you know. And I don't mean to deride Iron Maiden, because I love Iron Maiden, but it's just a fact. You cannot argue with it. There's a lot of novelty in Iron Maiden, and there's not a lot of that on Killers. It's just straightforward talent and straightforward good songs.
Well, you know, you mentioned earlier about skipping certain songs. I think that's why you're the contrarian this time, is because I think when most people hear those early songs, they don't sound like Iron Maiden. I think those are the songs that people skip. I do want to say also that, like, when you look at those later albums, like, Iron Maiden kind of burst into the mainstream with those later albums in the 80s, right? And especially, I think today they're bigger than ever, you know? And it was those albums with, you know, Bruce Dickinson later on and, you know, like Power Slave and Number of the Beast and stuff like that, that kind of made Iron Maiden as big and as popular as they are today, you know? Like, I don't think that you could take away those first two albums and their legacy would probably still be the same. I don't think that much of that had a consequence on what they were doing later on, you know?
I disagree. Mostly because a lot of these songs are still played live. They're still, once you become a big Iron Maiden fan and you start to really appreciate them, you're gonna want to learn where they came from. And when you find out where you came from, for some people like me, it's hard to go back.
Right. I'm just saying, if you take away those first two albums and you start, you know, and you still have Number of the Beast and Power Slave and Peace of Mind, I still think they're just as big today.
I think you're right. They'd still be just as popular. They'd probably be just as famous. I mean, I don't know if they would exist without what they achieved and broke through all the noise with those first two albums. Because, you know, when you have albums, when you have artists like Judas Priest, for example, or things like that, you know, it's hard to break through unless your sound is unique already. And without those first two unique albums, I don't know if they would have had any success at all. But I'll concede your point and say, okay, the success comes from the later sounds. But I still would argue that it comes from a focus on singles and a focus on big tracks as opposed to a great album. And I really feel on Killers, they put out a great album. And if you look at it as a whole compared to everything else they do, there's no track on there where you're not going to have a good time. Whereas if you go to Power Slave, you go to Number of the Beast, even Peace of Mind, you're going to have to listen through some songs that you're going to have to endure, not enjoy. Like, I personally don't want to sit through, 15, 12 minutes of Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner more than once or twice. It's a great achievement, but when it compares to Killers, I'd rather just listen to Killers. It's a solid album all the way through, and it's the last time they really made an album that was as good as it begins, in the middle, and when it ends.
So what do you think is the most popular, generally considered best Iron Maiden album? Public opinion.
Public opinion? I mean, I would think Number of the Beast is the most well-known. I think Power Slave has their most famous song. I'm not sure about that. I think a lot of people know 2 Minutes to Midnight.
And which is your favorite Iron Maiden album?
I like Killers.
And that's why we're the Contrarians, so hit that like and subscribe button. Let us know what you think is your best Iron Maiden album, and we'll see you next time.